The gun was already in her hand when Henry Keller stepped through the door of the Morgan homestead. Louise Morgan stood at the center of the dim front room, her dark hair loose and tangled from 3 sleepless nights, her jaw set so hard the muscles in her cheeks trembled. The Colt revolver she held was not aimed at the ceiling, not aimed at the floor. It was aimed directly at the deed she had pinned to the table with her left palm, the deed that named Silas Holt as the new owner of her land as of midnight Thursday. That was 2 days away. And tonight, a stranger had walked through her door without knocking. "You had better have a very good reason for walking into this house," she said, her voice stripped to its most elemental tone. Not anger, something past anger, something that had been burning so long it had turned cold. Henry Keller did not flinch. He was tall but not imposing, lean with hard-weathered muscle beneath a dusty canvas coat, his hat already in his hands by the time the barrel of her revolver registered in his mind. He held the hat against his chest and kept both palms open. Brown eyes steady, calm in the particular way of a man who had survived things he never talked about. "I knocked twice," he said. "Door swung in on its own. I heard someone moving and I was worried." "Worried," she repeated. The word came out like a small stone dropped down a well. "Ned Calloway sent me, said you needed a lawyer." "I needed a lawyer 3 weeks ago. Where was Ned sending lawyers 3 weeks ago?" Henry Keller said nothing to that. He looked at the deed under her hand. He looked at the revolver. He looked at her face, really looked at it, and something passed across his own face that was not pity and was not discomfort. It was recognition. "Put the gun down, Miss Morgan." "Not because I am afraid of it. Because your hand is shaking, and I don't think you have slept in days, and if you shoot a hole in that deed, it will not change its legal standing 1 inch." The shaking in her hand was not fear. She knew the difference between fear and exhaustion, and it was exhaustion that had been trying to pull her under for 11 months. 11 months since her father died. 11 months since she discovered what he had left behind, not just the land, not just the cattle, not just the debts that had been quietly drowning the Morgan name for years. 11 months since she found the letter that told her the full shape of her inheritance, a betrayal so old and so deep it had roots under every stone on this property. She lowered the gun slowly. Henry Keller let out a breath he had been controlling with professional precision. "Sit down," she said. "I will tell you everything, and then you will tell me if there is anything left to save." It had started on a morning in early April of 1882, when the ground was still cold enough that the frost came up through the floorboards of the Morgan farmhouse in the small hours and made Louise's feet ache before she even opened her eyes. She was 26 years old and had been running this property alone in every way that mattered for 4 years. Since her father, William Morgan, had lost the use of his left side to a fall from the horse barn roof in the winter of 1878. He had survived. He had sat in his chair by the fire and told her what to do, and she had done it, and slowly she had stopped asking and started deciding on her own, and slowly he had stopped offering much beyond the warmth of his company. He died in the spring of 1882 with his boots off, which he would have hated, and a half-finished letter on the small table beside his chair. Louise buried her father on a Tuesday. On Thursday she read the letter. It was addressed to her. The ink was uneven, written by a hand that had struggled, and she could see the effort in every word. It was the most honest document William Morgan had ever produced, which meant it was also the most devastating. He had borrowed money from Silas Holt in 1875. Not a small sum. Enough money to save the cattle operation after the blizzard of that winter had killed 30% of the herd and left the Morgan family staring at ruin. Silas Holt had been 43 then, a man with both hands in the land speculation business in southeastern Colorado Territory, and a reputation for understanding the exact amount a desperate man needed before he would sign anything. William Morgan had signed. He had signed a promissory agreement that included a buried clause language that his father likely could not have fully parsed without a legal education. That converted the loan to a lien on the property itself. if the principal was not repaid within 10 years. 10 years from 1875 was 1885. They were in 1882. Louise would have had 3 years. But the letter revealed something else, something that turned 3 years into no years at all. William Morgan had missed a payment structure within the loan, a secondary obligation that fell due every 3 years, a sum that served to demonstrate ongoing solvency. He had missed the payment in 1878, the same year he fell from the roof. He had not told Louise. He had not told anyone. He had simply held the secret inside himself for 4 years, and now Silas Holt had invoked the default clause, which under the terms of the agreement bypassed the original 1885 endpoint entirely and made the full debt due on demand. Silas Holt had sent his man to the Morgan property in April of 1882 with a formal demand notice. Louise had 60 days. She had spent those 60 days doing what she always did when something needed doing. She did it herself. She wrote to the bank in Pueblo. She wrote to 3 different men her father had mentioned as acquaintances with some legal knowledge. She attempted to negotiate directly with Silas Holt, who received her in his office in the town of Caldwell Creek, with the particular brand of courtesy that men like him used as a weapon, polite, unhurried, never once saying anything that could be quoted back as outright hostility. He simply told her the terms were clear. He told her the debt was the debt. He told her, with a smile she wanted to peel from his face with her bare hands, that he had always admired the Morgan land and would take good care of it. She had walked out of his office and gone directly to the general store and bought flour and salt and 2 pounds of dried beans and ridden home and made bread, because making bread was the one thing that required her whole hands and her whole attention and kept her from doing something that would land her in the territorial prison. Ned Calloway owned the livery stable on the east end of Caldwell Creek and was the closest thing to a friend that Louise allowed herself. He was 50-something, a former buffalo hunter who had turned respectable by degrees and now spent his days minding horses and other people's business with equal affection. He had known William Morgan for 20 years. He had watched Louise grow from a serious, soil-stained child into a serious, soil-stained woman with a mind like a steel trap and a heart that she kept hidden under 17 layers of practical competence. When Louise's 60 days ran out and the deadline arrived, and Silas Holt filed the formal transfer papers with the county clerk, it was Ned who went looking for help. He found Henry Keller in the town of Trinidad, 60 miles south, where Keller had recently set up the most modest legal practice in the territory, 1 room above a saddle shop, a desk, 3 chairs, a crate of law books, and a reputation that had traveled faster than he had. Henry Keller was 31 years old. He had read law in Kansas City and practiced for 4 years in Dodge City before some combination of personal disillusionment and professional restlessness had driven him toward the open country. He was not famous. He was not particularly ambitious in the way that produced famous men. What he was, and this was the thing Ned Calloway had heard about from a cattle rancher named Pescado who had watched him work, was constitutionally incapable of accepting an unfair outcome without exhausting every alternative first. He had arrived in Caldwell Creek on a Wednesday evening. He had knocked on Louise Morgan's door twice and been answered by a door that swung open and a woman holding a gun aimed at the last remaining evidence of everything she had worked for. Now he sat at her table with the deed between them and his coat on the back of the chair, and his sleeves rolled to the elbow in the practical way of a man who intended to work. And Louise Morgan stood at the window watching the dark pasture where her 22 remaining cattle stood like shadows, and she told him everything. She told him about the letter. She told him about the original loan agreement and the secondary payment clause and the default. She told him about her 60 days and the bank in Pueblo and the 3 men with legal knowledge who had written back with varying degrees of regret. She told him about Silas Holt's smile. Her voice did not waver once, and she did not look at Henry Keller as she spoke, because she had learned a long time ago that looking at someone while you told them something terrible gave them too much access to what it cost you. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the pop of the fire and the distant settling of the house. Henry Keller had been writing. He had produced a small leather notebook from his coat pocket and filled 4 pages with careful, close handwriting, and he read back through it twice before he spoke. "The secondary payment clause," he said. "Do you have the original agreement document, your father's copy?" "I have everything. Every piece of paper my father ever touched. I found them all in a box under his bed." The original agreement would need to have been filed with the county clerk in 1875 to be legally enforceable as a lien. If it was not filed within 30 days of execution, the lien has no standing. Louise turned from the window. This was the first thing anyone had said to her in 11 months that sounded like it might have an edge. "Can you check that?" "I can check it first thing tomorrow morning. County records are public." He looked at her steadily. "There is something else. The default clause you described, the one that accelerates the full debt, that language, if it exists in the form you are describing, would have been unusual even in 1875. Colorado Territory had adopted substantial portions of the Ohio Commercial Code at that time. There were limitations on acceleration clauses in personal property loans. A mortgage on land was different. A general lien converted from a personal loan was in a gray area. Depending on how that language was written, Holt may have overreached. "You are saying there is a possibility. I am saying there are 2 specific threads I need to pull before I can tell you how much possibility there is. I will need to see the original agreement, tonight if you are willing." Louise crossed the room, went to the small bedroom that had been her father's, and came back with a wooden box. She set it on the table. Henry Keller opened it with the careful respect of a man handling something that mattered to someone else and began to read. She watched him as he worked. She had not meant to watch him. She had meant to do something useful, feed the fire, check on the cattle, anything. But she found herself standing at the far end of the table with her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes on his face as the lamplight moved across it. He was not a handsome man in any particular or obvious way. His face was angular and a little too lean, with the kind of sun damage that came from years outdoors, and there was a pale scar along the left side of his jaw that she found her eyes returning to. But what was remarkable about his face, she thought, was the quality of his concentration. When he read, he was entirely present. There was no performance of effort, no furrowing of brow for effect. He simply read and turned pages, and sometimes made a small sound of recognition in the back of his throat that told her he had found something worth noting. After an hour, he looked up. The agreement was not filed with the county clerk. Louise's heart moved in a way it had not moved in a very long time. "How do you know?" "Because there is no clerk's stamp on this document. For a lien to be enforceable, the original must carry the clerk's acknowledgement. This copy has none. Now it is possible Holt retained the copy with the stamp, and your father received this unsigned one. That was common practice. But if there is no filing record in the county records, then the lien itself is a legal fiction. He can claim a personal debt. He cannot claim your land. He already filed the transfer papers. He filed them based on the enforcement of that lien. If the lien is invalid, the transfer is invalid." Louise sat down in the chair across from him. She did not do it gracefully. She simply sat, all at once, the way a person does when their legs make the decision independently. "I need to check the records tomorrow," Henry said. His voice was quiet and careful. He was watching her the way he had watched her when he first came in, that attentive, unperforming quality. "I do not want to tell you this is solved before I have confirmed it. But what I can tell you tonight is that Silas Holt may have made a procedural error that unravels the entire thing." "Why?" Louise said, and her voice came out unsteady for the first time. "Did none of the other men think to look for that?" Henry Keller was quiet for a moment. "Because they were looking at the debt," he said finally. "I looked at the instrument." She picked up the loan document and held it in both hands and stared at it. 11 months. 11 months of carrying the weight of this thing alone, of waking at 3 in the morning with the specific terror of a person who can see the ground disappearing beneath their feet and has no one to catch them. Her mother had died when she was 8. Her only brother had gone to California in 1876 and written twice, and then stopped writing. She had made herself the sort of person who did not need to be caught, because needing to be caught required trusting someone to be there, and trusting people was a luxury she had learned she could not afford. "You have been carrying this alone," Henry Keller said. He was not gentle about it. He was simply accurate. It was a statement, not a comfort, and it landed differently than comfort would have. Something happened in Louise Morgan's chest, something that had been locked for a very long time, sealed so tightly she had stopped being aware of it, shifted, just slightly. The way ice shifts in the first week of spring when the change is all interior and the surface still looks solid. She put the document down. "Tell me what you need from me to do this properly," she said. Henry Keller turned to a fresh page in his notebook. "Tell me everything your father told you about the day he signed." They talked until 2 in the morning. The county record's office in Caldwell Creek was housed in the back half of the courthouse building, which was a wood-frame structure on Main Street that also contained the sheriff's office, the justice of the peace, and a room that served variously as a courtroom, a meeting hall, and a space for community dances. The clerk was a meticulous man named Arthur Bunce, who had held the position for 9 years and whose filing system was, by the standards of the territory, extraordinary. Henry Keller arrived when the office opened at 8. He was thorough and methodical, working backward from 1882 through the filing records for liens and instruments registered in the name of Holt and Morgan. Arthur Bunce brought him 3 ledgers without being asked, which suggested to Henry that the clerk either respected legal work or disliked Silas Holt, and possibly both. There was no filing, no record anywhere of a lien instrument between Silas Holt and William Morgan registered in 1875 or in any subsequent year. The loan existed only in the document held in that wooden box under William Morgan's bed. Henry sat with this information for a full minute before he allowed himself to feel anything about it. Then he stood up, thanked Arthur Bunce, and walked outside into the morning air of Caldwell Creek and stood very still on the courthouse steps while the sun worked its way above the roofline of the building across the street. The transfer papers that Holt had filed were based on a legally void instrument. The land was not Holt's. The transfer could be challenged and, if challenged properly, overturned. He rode to the Morgan property. Louise was in the pasture when he arrived, mending a section of fence with the focused economy of someone who had done this particular task 400 times. She had her hair tied back and her sleeves pushed up, and she was working with wire and a pair of pliers, and she did not stop working when she heard his horse, though she looked up. He told her what he had found. She listened with the wire still in her hands and the pliers still open, and she did not say anything for a long moment. Then she set the wire down carefully on the fence post and put the pliers in her apron pocket and looked at him with an expression that he would think about for the rest of his life. Not relief, exactly, not joy, but something more fundamental. The expression of a person who has been standing in water up to their chin for so long they have forgotten what standing on dry ground felt like, and who has just been told the water is receding. "What happens now?" she said. "I file a motion to vacate the transfer with the district court. I attach the original agreement document and the record of no filing. I petition for a temporary injunction preventing any further action on the property during the proceeding. If the judge agrees, and I believe the judge will agree because the law is quite clear on this, Holt's transfer is reversed. Silas Holt will not accept that easily." "No," Henry said. "He will not. He was right about that." The injunction was granted within 4 days by Judge Clement Reyes, who was a compact, precise man from Santa Fe who had seen enough land fraud cases in his tenure to recognize the shape of one quickly. Silas Holt retained an attorney from Denver named Corbin Blass, who arrived in Caldwell Creek on the stage with 2 trunks of luggage and the specific air of a man who expected the local situation to resolve itself in his favor by the weight of his professional presence alone. Corbin Blass was not wrong to have confidence. He was experienced, well-connected, and technically competent. He filed 3 counter motions in the first week, each designed to shift the question from the validity of the lien to the validity of Louise's occupancy rights during the challenge period. He argued that the injunction placed an undue burden on his client's legitimate commercial interests. He attempted to introduce character testimony about William Morgan's reputation for financial unreliability. Henry Keller answered every motion. He worked at Louise's kitchen table because that was where the documents were, and because the 20-mile ride back to Trinidad each evening and forward again each morning consumed hours he needed for the work. Louise fed him. This arrangement evolved without discussion, which was the way most of the important things between them seemed to evolve. She cooked straightforwardly beans and salt pork and corn bread, and on the evenings when there was a chicken that had stopped laying, a stew that was remarkable. She did not make any particular fuss about feeding him, which he appreciated, because fuss would have made the situation awkward, and the situation was already complicated enough. They talked while they worked, which meant they talked constantly, because he was always working and she was always doing something useful in the same space. They talked about the law and about the property, and about what options existed if the district court did not rule in her favor. They talked about William Morgan and about what Louise remembered of the years before the fall, when her father had been a different kind of man, one who laughed easily and rode with her in the evenings and told her stories about the land as though it were alive. He was not a dishonest man, she said one evening, without looking up from the bread she was making. He was a frightened man, and he made one bad decision when he was frightened, and then he spent 7 years being too ashamed to tell anyone about it. That is a very human thing, Henry said. It nearly cost me everything. It still might. He said it evenly, not cruelly. She had asked him once in their first week of working together to be honest with her always, even when honesty was uncomfortable, and he had agreed with a directness that told her he considered it a reasonable thing to ask for. "I know," she said, "but at least now I know where I stand." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was a kind of silence Louise had not experienced with another person for a very long time. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why are you here? Not here in this house, here in this territory. Ned told me you were in Dodge City before." "Dodge City is, well, it is Dodge City. A man with legal training could do better there than here." Henry was quiet for a moment. He turned his pen over in his fingers. "I could do more there," he said finally. "I am not certain more and better are the same thing." That is a careful answer. It is an honest answer. He looked up from the page. "I left Dodge City because I spent 2 years there helping the cattle associations write contracts that protected their interests against the interests of individual homesteaders. I was good at it. I was well paid for it. And one morning I sat down to draft an instrument that would have allowed a ranching concern to claim water rights that effectively made 4 smaller operations unviable. And I thought about the people in those operations, whether they had families, whether they knew what was coming, and I put the pen down and walked out and did not go back." Louise looked at him. "That was brave." "That was impractical," he said. "I gave up a significant income. My former employer spent 3 months telling everyone in Dodge City that I was unreliable." "You gave up money because you thought something was wrong," she said. "That is brave. Being practical about it afterward is just sense." He looked at her with that steady brown gaze, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the fire popped and the bread sat rising under its cloth, and outside the spring wind moved across the Colorado land, and Louise felt something shift in her chest again. Deeper this time. Not ice. Something else. She looked back down at the bread and said nothing, because she did not yet have language for what she was feeling, and she had a policy of not speaking things she could not yet put into full sentences. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of May. 2 days before the hearing, Louise came home from the cattle pasture to find that someone had opened the gate on the near field and driven 3 of her cattle off. The gate was not broken. It had been opened by a person who knew what they were doing and wanted the message to be clear. She found Henry at the table when she came in, and she told him what she had found, and her voice was steady but her hands were not. He stood up immediately. "Do not go after them tonight," he said. "I was not going to go after them tonight. I know, I said it anyway." He was already reaching for his coat. "I am going to ride to the sheriff. Ethan Craw is Silas Holt's poker companion. He has been sheriff for 6 years because Silas Holt supports the people who support Silas Holt." Henry paused with his coat half on. "I know," he said. "I am going anyway, because when this comes before Judge Ray's, I want a formal record of an intimidation attempt 2 days before the hearing." She had not thought of it that way. She had thought of it as a violation, as a provocation, as evidence that Holt was frightened enough to act badly. She had not thought of it as a document. This was what it was like. She was beginning to understand, to have someone thinking alongside you instead of behind you. It changed the geometry of a problem. Things that looked like dead ends from one angle had a different shape when viewed from beside someone who was facing the same direction. Henry rode to the sheriff's office. Ethan Craw received him with polite unhelpfulness, no witnesses, no evidence of wrongdoing, cattle strayed in the night. Henry filed a written complaint anyway, which Craw accepted with the resignation of a man who knew what paper trails could cost. The morning of the hearing, Louise wore the best dress she owned, which was a dark blue wool that she had made herself 3 winters ago and which fit well and made her look, as Ned Calloway had once told her, like someone a person would want on their side. She pinned her hair up with the 2 ivory pins that had been her mother's. She rode into Caldwell Creek sitting straight in the saddle. The courtroom held 40 people, and all 40 of them appeared to be present. Ned Calloway was in the 3rd row. Several of the neighboring homesteaders were there, the Castillo family from the North Quarter, the 2 Peterson brothers from the Creek Road. Silas Holt sat at the respondent's table in a coat that had cost more than Louise's horse, and Corbin Blass sat beside him with his 2 trunks worth of professional gravity. Henry Keller sat across from them at the petitioner's table with his leather notebook and a neat stack of documents, and the particular quality of stillness that she had come to recognize as his version of readiness. Judge Ray's entered at 9 on the dot. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Henry presented the case with an economy and precision that was, Louise thought, almost beautiful in its lack of waste. Every word did work. Every document was exactly placed. He walked Judge Ray's through the original agreement, through the absence of a filing record, through the legal requirements for lien validity under the commercial code that Colorado Territory had adopted, through the specific language of the default clause and its divergence from standard practice. Corbin Blass was impressive. He was not wrong to be confident. He built a case on the argument that the intent of the agreement was clear, that both parties had understood the lien to be in force, and that a technical filing error should not allow a debtor's estate to escape its obligations. It was a reasonable argument made by a skilled man. Henry's rebuttal was quiet and specific. Intent, he argued, was irrelevant to the legal standing of a lien. The instrument that Silas Holt was attempting to enforce had never been legally registered. A lien that was never registered was not a lien. It was an uncollected personal debt. Silas Holt had every right to pursue that debt through the proper channels. He did not have the right to claim a woman's land on the basis of an instrument that did not legally exist. Judge Ray's took 40 minutes. He came back and ruled in favor of Louise Morgan. The transfer was vacated. The injunction was made permanent. The property was confirmed in the name of the Morgan estate, which meant Louise Morgan. Louise sat very still when the gavel came down. Around her, Ned Calloway made a sound that was almost a shout. quickly suppressed. The Castillo family leaned together. The Peterson brothers looked satisfied in the way of men who had expected justice and were pleased to be right. At the respondents' table, Silas Holt's face was the color of old ash. Corbin Blass was already packing his papers with the practiced neutrality of a professional accepting a professional outcome. Henry Keller turned to look at Louise. He did not say anything. He did not need to. His expression was warm and quiet and entirely directed at her, and she looked back at him and felt that shift in her chest for the third time. And this time it was not a small thing. This time it was the unmistakable collapse of something that had been holding against great pressure for a very long time, and what replaced it was not relief and not joy, but something more dangerous to her carefully constructed self-sufficiency. It was the desire to reach across the table and take his hand. She did not do it. She folded her hands in her lap and breathed and let Ned Calloway reach past her to shake Henry's hand with enormous enthusiasm. Outside the courthouse afterward, in the May sunlight that came off the main street of Caldwell Creek with all the generosity of late spring, people came to speak to her. The Castillos embraced her. The Peterson brothers shook her hand. Ned Calloway told her he had known it would come right, and then his eyes got bright and he looked away at the rooftops. Silas Holt passed her on his way to his horse without looking at her. He was not finished. She was not naive enough to think he was finished, but for today, in this moment, he had been made smaller. Not by force, not by a gun, but by a young lawyer with a leather notebook who had looked at an instrument when everyone else looked at a debt. She found Henry standing at the edge of the courthouse steps, looking out at the street. She went and stood beside him. "Thank you," she said. "I told you there was something to find." "You did. You were right." She was quiet for a moment. The street moved around them, horses, two women with a baby carriage, a man rolling a barrel toward the dry goods store. The ordinary life of a western town on a Thursday in May 1882. "What do I owe you?" He turned to look at her. "I have been working out of your kitchen for 3 weeks. You have fed me every day." "That is not a legal fee." "No," he agreed. "I will think of something fair and tell you." She looked at him, and the sunlight was on the side of his face, and the scar along his jaw was visible, and there was something so entirely known about his face now, after these 3 weeks of close quarters and late nights and honest conversation, that it startled her. She could not remember the last time a person's face had been known to her in this way. "Will you come back to the property tonight?" she said. "I want to look at the pasture fence, and I want someone to tell me whether I have any legal recourse for the 3 cattle that were taken." He did not smile, but there was something in his eyes that was almost a smile, the restrained version of one. "Yes," he said, "I will come back tonight." She rode back ahead of him, and by the time he arrived she had the stew on and the table cleared of anything that was not necessary, and a bottle of whiskey set out that she had been keeping since her father's last good Christmas. She poured 2 glasses when he came in and handed him one, and they stood on either side of the table, and he raised his glass. "To the Morgan property," he said. "To the instrument," she said. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a good laugh, genuine and low and a little surprised at itself, as though he was not entirely accustomed to the feeling. It changed his face significantly, opened it, and she stood with her glass in her hand and felt the full weight of what she was beginning to feel for him, and it was not a comfortable feeling, not yet, because comfort required a kind of certainty she did not have and could not build in 3 weeks, but it was real. That she could not argue with. They talked through dinner about the property's legal standing going forward, about the personal debt that Silas Holt still held claim to, about the best strategy for addressing it. Henry had already been thinking about options. If Louise could demonstrate the original loan value against the improvements made to the property in the intervening years, improvements made entirely through her own labor and capital, there was an argument to be made that the debt had been substantially satisfied through property maintenance that Holt had benefited from as a lien claimant in waiting. It was a complicated argument, one that might not hold in every court, but in a territory court with a judge like Clement Ray's it had real legs. You have already been thinking past this, she said. I think past things, he said. It is a habit. Not past things, she corrected. Past my things. You have been thinking about my situation when you did not need to. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a coyote called in the middle distance, a thin, spiraling sound that the wind carried away before it finished. I have been thinking about your situation, he agreed. Yes. The acknowledgement sat between them, and neither of them dressed it up or explained it, and the fire was low and warm, and the whiskey was smooth, and the stew was finished, and the night was full around the walls of the house. Henry, she said. It was the first time she had called him by his first name. She had not planned it. It came out because that was his name, and it was the most honest way to address what she was about to say. He looked at her. I am not a person who finds it easy to let someone help me, she said. I have been running this place and this life on my own for a long time, and I have built the kind of habits you build when you do that, and some of those habits are not entirely good ones. I am telling you this because I think you should know who you are dealing with. I know who I am dealing with, he said. I am not finished. He waited. I have valued your presence here, very much, more than I expected to when Ned sent you. And I am aware that you came here to do a job, and the job is largely done, and you have a practice in Trinidad that you presumably need to return to, and I do not know how to ask someone to stay without sounding like I am claiming something I have no right to claim. Henry Keller set his glass down on the table with very great care. He looked at her for a long moment with that steady attentiveness that was entirely his own, that quality of full presence. Ask me, he said simply. She met his eyes, the fire popped, the coyote was silent. Stay, she said. He stayed. Not in the house. There was propriety to consider, and neighbors who watched, and a world that had opinions. He rode back to Caldwell Creek most nights and took a room at the boarding house on the south end of town, run by a widow named Mrs. Gareth, who served breakfast at 6 and did not ask questions as long as rent was paid on time. He rode out to the Morgan property in the mornings, and they worked through the remaining legal tangles, and sometimes they rode the property together in the evenings, checking the cattle, examining the fence lines, talking. The talking was, for Louise, the most extraordinary part of it. She had not realized how much she had been starving for someone to talk to, not for conversation, not for social exchange, but for the particular sustenance of being understood by a mind that was genuinely engaged with the same things that engaged yours. Henry Keller was interested in everything she was interested in, and he was interesting in return, which was a combination that she had not encountered in 26 years of life, and that she found, now that she had encountered it, impossible to imagine going without. He was interested in the law, which she had known. But he was also interested in land, in the specific character of this piece of southeastern Colorado high plains, in the way the grass species changed with elevation across the property, in the water table and what it suggested about long-term sustainability. He had grown up on a farm in Ohio, he told her, and had gone to the city to read law because it seemed more serious than farming, and had spent years discovering that serious was not the same as satisfying. Do you regret it? She asked one evening, standing at the west fence where the view opened across a mile of grass to the blue-gray line of the mountains. I did for a while, he said. I think I was trying to be someone my father would have called a success. He had very specific ideas about what that looked like. And now, he looked at the mountains. I think success is a word that should belong to the person living the life, not the person observing it. She looked at him in the mountain light and thought, I am in love with this man. The thought arrived with the clarity of something that had been true for a while waiting to be acknowledged, and she held it in her mind and examined it from several angles, and found that it did not frighten her the way she would have expected. What it did was make her feel the weight of the distance she kept. The habits he did not know about, the way she left a room when she felt something too directly, the way she answered personal questions with practical ones, the way she had spent 11 months carrying the entire Morgan disaster in complete solitude, telling no one, asking for nothing, as though the asking itself were a kind of defeat. She had been 14 when her mother died. Her father had gone silent with grief for 3 months, and she had kept the household running with the help of a neighbor woman twice a week and a great deal of silent, furious determination. The determination had served her. The silence had become a habit. The habit had calcified over years into something she called self-reliance, and that was genuinely that. But that was also, she could see now, a wall. Henry had walked through the wall by accident. Or not by accident, by the specific quality of his attentiveness, by his habit of looking at instruments when other people looked at debts, which was its own kind of metaphor. It was Ned Calloway who said it out loud first, because Ned Calloway had no internal governor and considered this a feature. "Henry Keller is the first man you have talked to like a person in about 8 years," he said to her one morning when she came to the livery to have her horse's shoes checked. "And I mean that as a compliment to both of you. Ned," she said, "I am not saying anything that is not true. You are saying things that are mine to decide about." "I am saying things that are true," he repeated, entirely unrepentant, and she paid him for the shoes and rode away knowing he was not wrong. The question of the personal debt Holt's remaining claim to the original loan principal came to a resolution 3 weeks after the hearing, through a combination of Henry's argument about property maintenance value and a piece of information that surfaced from an unexpected direction. Arthur Bunce, the county clerk, came to Henry privately with a document he had found in his records from 1877, a satisfaction of partial payment, signed by both Holt and William Morgan, that had been filed and then buried in a miscategorized folder. Holt had never mentioned it because he had calculated correctly that no one would look for it. The partial payment reduced the outstanding principal by a sum that, when combined with Henry's property maintenance argument, brought the remaining debt down to a figure that Louise could actually address a manageable note, payable over 5 years, to be held by the county rather than by Holt, who had forfeited his creditor status through the fraudulent transfer attempt. Judge Rays issued the final order on a Tuesday in June. Louise Morgan owned her land, free of Silas Holt, with a straightforward repayment schedule for the reduced debt. It was over. She found out when Henry rode out to tell her in the early afternoon, and she was in the barn when he came, up on a ladder mending the hay loft floor where 2 boards had gone soft, and he stood below the ladder and told her, and she came down the ladder and stood in the barn floor in the smell of hay and horses, and she put both hands over her face and did not cry, but something came out of her that she had not let out in 11 months. A long shaking exhale that was not quite a sob and not quite a breath but something in between, the sound of a person finally putting down a weight they had carried until it had become the shape of their spine. Henry was there. He was right there. He did not say anything. He put his arms around her and held her, and she stood in the circle of his arms in the barn in June 1882 and let herself be held for the first time in longer than she could name, and it was the strangest and most whole thing she had felt in years. When she pulled back she was not embarrassed, which surprised her. She looked at his face, which was close, and his expression was the same as it always was, attentive and honest and entirely present. But there was something else in it now that she recognized because she had been feeling it herself. "I have been wanting to say something to you," he said. "Say it," she said. Because she had learned with him not to hedge, and she was not willing to go back to hedging now. "I came here to do a job," he said. "I am aware of that. You are aware of that. I want to be clear that what I am about to say is entirely separate from the job and from any obligation you might feel because of it. And if it is unwelcome, I will respect that fully, and nothing between us needs to change if you do not want it to." "Henry," she said, "I am not finished." It was her own words from that night with the whiskey, and she felt something warm and bright move through her chest at hearing them. "I think I began to understand what you meant to me the night you said ask me and then said stay," he continued, "because I realized that asking you to ask me was the most natural thing I had done in years, and that staying was what I already wanted to do, and that those two things had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with you specifically, Louise, and the particular way you work and think and exist in the world. He paused. I am in love with you. I think I have been for some weeks. I wanted you to know, because you told me once to be honest with you always, and I intend to keep that agreement. Louise Morgan stood in her barn in the June light and looked at this man who had come through her door when she had a gun in her hand and stayed until the ground was solid again, who had thought past her problems when he had no obligation to, who had held her in the barn 3 minutes ago without needing anything from her in return. And she thought about all the years of being alone in her capability and what it had cost her and what it had built in her, and whether the building could now include something it had not included before. I am in love with you too, she said. Simply, directly, without the hedging she might have used a month ago. I have been trying to work out what to do about it. What did you decide? He said. I decided that I am 30 years of age this September and have spent enough of my life being practical about things that do not require practicality. He smiled. The full version, not the restrained one. It changed his whole face, opened it completely, and she stepped forward and kissed him, which was something she had wanted to do for at least 3 weeks and which was as natural and as certain as anything she had ever done. He kissed her back with the same quality he brought to everything, entirely present, entirely honest, nothing performed. When she stepped back, she was smiling too, which was its own kind of revelation because she was not a woman who smiled easily or frequently, and the ease of it now told her something about what this was. I am going to say something practical now, she said. Of course you are. Your practice is in Trinidad. My practice is wherever I am working. I have been working here for 2 months. A practice, technically, is a portable thing. Caldwell Creek could use a lawyer who is not on Silas Holt's payroll. Caldwell Creek could, he agreed. Ned Calloway would likely know of a room or a building you could use. Ned Calloway would know that, yes. Henry looked at her with the almost smile, the restrained, warm version. Are you asking me to stay again? I am observing that the conditions for staying exist, she said. What you do with that observation is entirely your own decision. He reached out and took her hand. Just that, a simple, complete gesture, the whole of his hand around hers, warm and certain. I will stay, he said. Ned Calloway, when informed of the legal development and then, shortly afterward, the personal one, did not say I told you so. He said it with his face, comprehensively and at length, and then shook Henry's hand for so long that Henry eventually had to extract his own hand physically. And then he sat Louise down and told her that her mother would have been very pleased, and his eyes went bright again, and this time Louise let hers do the same. The summer of 1882 was good to the Morgan property in a way that felt, after everything, almost extravagant. The grass was strong, the cattle healthy. The 3 animals that had been taken from the field eventually turned up at a neighboring property's water source, likely driven there, and released rather than butchered, which suggested that whoever Holt had sent had not wanted to commit to fully criminal behavior. Louise reclaimed them without making a formal issue of it, because the legal battle was over, and she had no interest in spending energy on Silas Holt a day longer than necessary. Holt himself retreated. He remained in the county, and his presence was still felt in the way of a man who controlled a certain amount of commercial machinery. But he directed that machinery away from Louise Morgan with the caution of someone who had been publicly embarrassed by a competent young lawyer and did not want to repeat the experience. This was, Henry explained, the most realistic outcome. Men like Holt rarely reformed, but they recalculated. Henry did indeed set up a practice in Caldwell Creek, in a room above the newspaper office that the printer rented him for a modest monthly sum. He spent 4 mornings a week there, and the rest of his time at the Morgan property, which evolved over the summer from a working arrangement into a genuine partnership in the fullest sense. He repaired the south fence sections Louise had been meaning to get to since winter. She taught him how to read the grass for signs of cattle health that she had learned from observation over years and that no book mentioned. He brought legal newspapers from Trinidad when he made the trip once a month to deal with outstanding business there, and they read them in the evenings and argued about cases, and she had opinions that were sharp and well-reasoned, and that he challenged, and she defended and sometimes reversed and sometimes held, and the whole activity was, for both of them, among the deepest pleasures of their days. In August, Henry rode to Trinidad for what he described as business and came back with a small box from the jeweler there. He did not produce the box dramatically or make a formal occasion of it. He came in from riding, set the box on the table beside her evening reading, said nothing, and went to wash up. She opened the box, which contained a ring, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, turquoise being the stone of the Southwest in a way that gold from anywhere could not have been, and sat looking at it for a long moment. He came back from washing up and she was still looking at it. "That is a question," he said. "I can see that." She looked up at him. "The answer is yes." He sat down across from her and took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger and held her hand in both of his for a moment, and there was nothing theatrical about it, nothing performed, just the same quality he had brought to everything from the very first night: presence, honesty, the full weight of his attention. "I know you do not need me," he said. "I want to be clear that I know that." "I know," she said. "I want you anyway." "That is the only basis on which I would want to be wanted," he said. They married in September 1882, on the same day Louise Morgan turned 30 years old. The ceremony was held in the yard of the Morgan property, because she had no intention of being married anywhere but her own land, and Ned Calloway stood up for them both with the efficiency of a man performing two functions at once, and Judge Reyes conducted the ceremony as a favor, and the Castillo family and the Peterson brothers and Mrs. Gareth from the boarding house and a dozen other people from town, and the surrounding farms stood in the early autumn grass and watched. It was a clear day, cold in the shadows and warm in the sun, the way September was in that part of Colorado, and the mountains were blue and sharp on the western horizon, and the cattle were in the far pasture, and the hay was in, and the fence was good, and the land was hers, theirs. And Louise Morgan stood in the best dress that had once made her look like someone worth having on your side, and held Henry Keller's hands and said the words, and meant every syllable with a directness that was entirely characteristic. They had a party that evening that went on until past midnight, which was unusual for a community of working people who rose at 5. And Ned Calloway told the story of the first night he had heard about Louise Morgan holding a gun over a deed to 3 different people who had already heard it, and it got better each time. The work continued, because work on a cattle property did not pause for personal transformation. If anything, the work intensified, because 2 people working alongside each other with genuine investment in the outcome did more than 1 person working alone. And the Morgan property began in the following year to show what it was capable of when it was properly managed by people who were not simultaneously fighting a legal battle for its survival. Henry kept his law practice in Caldwell Creek, and it grew, because the territory had no shortage of people who needed the kind of legal work that did not involve protecting large commercial interests from small individual ones. He handled homestead disputes and estate matters, and the occasional more complicated case that came in from Trinidad or further south. His reputation in the region became, within a year, exactly what Ned Calloway had once said Caldwell Creek needed: a lawyer who could not be bought. Silas Holt attempted once more in the spring of 1883 to cause difficulty for the Morgan property, not directly this time, but through a water rights claim filed with the county that, had it been accepted, would have complicated Louise's irrigation schedule. Henry addressed it in his characteristic way. He went to the records, found the specific precedent that applied, drafted a formal objection in 2 days, and the claim was dismissed within a week. Holt did not try again. There was a particular evening in the late spring of 1883 that Louise thought about for years afterward as the moment she understood the full shape of what she had allowed herself to have. It was nothing significant by external measure, an ordinary Tuesday evening, Henry at the kitchen table reading a case document, herself at the window watching the last light on the pasture, the fire going, the smell of the coffee she had made an hour ago still in the room. She was thinking about her mother, about what it had been like to be 8 years old and have the house go silent in a specific way that it never stopped being silent after, about the self that she had built in that silence, sturdy and capable and solitary, about the fact that the self she had built was still entirely hers. She had not surrendered any of it, had not been asked to, but that it was no longer alone in the house. Henry looked up from his reading, caught her expression, and said nothing. He simply looked at her with full attention, and she looked back, and the understanding passed between them without language, which was a kind of intimacy that she had not known was possible, and that made the solitary years feel, not wasted exactly, but finished, as though they had led here by a route that was the only route that existed. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Instruments," she said. He laughed again, the genuine low laugh that she had been hearing for a year now, and that still did something pleasant to her chest every time. In the fall of 1883, Louise told Henry she was expecting. She told him in the practical way she did most things, matter of fact, direct, watching his face. What happened to his face was worth watching. Not surprise, exactly, though there was some of that, but a kind of deep, luminous openness that she had never seen on him before, a crack in the composed attentiveness that revealed something younger and less defended underneath. He came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "Are you pleased?" "I am very pleased," she said. "Are you?" He kissed her forehead. "I have no language for how pleased I am," he said. "I will find it eventually." Their son was born in the spring of 1884 in the bedroom of the Morgan property, attended by the doctor from Caldwell Creek and Mrs. Gareth, who had turned out to have considerable experience with birthing. It was a good birth, hard but straightforward, and the boy came out looking, as Ned Calloway declared when he saw him the following day, like he had opinions about things already. They named him William Henry Keller. William for Louise's father, who had been a frightened man who made one bad decision and spent 7 years ashamed of it, and who had also been a man who loved his land and his daughter and who had, in the end, written the truth. Henry for his father, plainly. Ned Calloway held the baby on the second day, having ridden out specifically for the purpose, and sat with him for 20 minutes in the rocker by the fire with the specific serenity of an old man holding new life, and said nothing at all, which was the most unusual thing Ned Calloway had done in Louise's memory. The property thrived. The law practice thrived. The marriage was, by the measure of both people in it, exactly what it was supposed to be, not effortless, because nothing worthwhile was effortless, but genuine in a way that made effort feel like its own reward. They disagreed, sometimes sharply, and resolved disagreements the same way they did everything else, by looking at the instrument rather than the debt, by being honest when honesty was uncomfortable, by remembering that the other person was not an adversary but a partner. William grew. He was a serious child, dark-haired like his mother, with his father's quality of attentiveness. He followed Louise around the pasture and sat in the kitchen while Henry worked and asked questions with an energy that delighted both of them and sometimes exhausted them. In 1886, Louise told Henry she was expecting again. He already knew. He had by then learned to read her in the way he read documents, looking for the small particular signs that preceded the larger truth. "You look like someone thinking about an instrument," he told her one morning when she was standing at the kitchen window in the early light. She laughed her own laugh, which had become a regular feature of her days in a way that would have surprised her younger self. "I have something to tell you," she said. "I know," he said. "When?" "Next February." Their daughter was born in February 1887. They named her Clara, which was Louise's mother's name, and Clara came into the world with strong lungs and an expression of determined assessment that was so entirely her mother's that Henry laughed in the delivery room despite himself, and the doctor thought he had lost his mind. William, who was 3, regarded his sister with the cautious diplomatic interest of a person aware that a new variable had been introduced into a previously comprehensible system. Within 2 weeks he had decided she was acceptable. Within a month, he was her most vocal advocate when anyone startled her. The Morgan property, which everyone in the county still called the Morgan property, even though it was legally the Keller property, because the land had been Morgan land for longer than anyone could clearly remember and names for places came from history rather than paperwork, became, through the second half of the 1880s, one of the more successful mid-sized cattle operations in that part of Colorado Territory. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but solid, well-managed, and run with the kind of ethical clarity that made it a place that other operations in the county used as a reference point. Louise was known throughout the region as someone who kept fair terms with the men and women who worked with her, which in an era when that was not guaranteed was itself a form of reputation. Henry's law practice had grown to the point where he took on a junior associate, a young man named Parsons who had read law in Denver and come south looking for work, and this freed Henry to take on more complex cases and to spend more time at the property. Silas Holt died in 1887. He died in his office, which was somehow appropriate of a collapse that the doctor called a failure of the heart, which Ned Calloway, at the funeral he attended out of civic duty, called something else entirely in a low voice to Henry. His land holdings were divided among creditors and business partners in a process that took 2 years and that Henry had no part in, having declined the invitation to serve as one of the estate's legal advisors on the grounds that he considered it a conflict of professional integrity. The territory became the state of Colorado in 1876, 8 years before all of this, but statehood was a gradual thing in its effects on how people lived and worked, and Caldwell Creek in the 1880s was still operating in many of the practical ways of territory life. The distances were the same, the self-reliance was the same, the specific combination of community interdependence and individual stubbornness that characterized frontier life was still the dominant mode. The railroad came through a spur line 30 miles south in 1885, which changed the cattle shipping economics significantly and allowed Louise to expand the operation in ways that a previous generation would have found difficult. She was, as she turned 35 in 1887, a woman fully inhabiting her life in a way she had not been at 25 or 30. It was not that she had been half alive before. She had been fully engaged, fully capable, fully present. But there is a difference between living fully inside a defended perimeter and living fully in the open, and she had not understood the difference until Henry Keller had stood below a ladder in her barn and been there when she finally put something down. She thought about this sometimes on the morning rides she still took alone, before the children were up and before Henry left for town, when the land was hers in the most elemental way, no obligations, no voices, just the high plains grass and the cold morning air and the cattle moving like slow, dark shapes in the distance. She had always taken these rides, even in the hardest years. It was where she thought most clearly. What was different now was what she came home to. She came home to a kitchen where Henry was making coffee with William on his hip, because the boy had refused to stay in his bed. She came home to Clara's voice at full volume demanding something from someone. She came home to the mess and warmth of a household that was alive, and every morning of it she understood, with increasing rather than decreasing clarity, what it would have cost her if a lawyer from Trinidad with a leather notebook had not walked through a door that swung open on its own. In the evenings, after the children were down and the work was done, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Henry and Louise sat at the kitchen table that had been the site of their first long conversation, and talked, or read, or worked on whatever needed working on. These hours were different from all other hours. They belonged entirely to themselves, and they were used accordingly. One such evening in the autumn of 1887, Henry looked up from the legal newspaper he was reading and said, without preamble, "I have been offered a position." Louise looked up. "What kind?" "District judge. Judge Reyes is retiring in January. He recommended me to the governor's office." He said it evenly, with no performance of what he felt about it. Louise set down her pen. She looked at him for a moment. "Do you want it?" "I think I might," he said, which surprised me. "It should not surprise you. You have the mind for it." "I have the temperament for it, possibly. I am not certain about the ambition for it." "Those are different things," she said. "I know." She considered. "If you took it, the practice would need to be wound down or handed to Parsons." "Yes. Parsons is ready for it. And the schedule would change. Circuit court means time away. Not as much as it once would have. The circuit is smaller now than when Reyes took the position. There is talk of a permanent seat in Pueblo within 5 years. Louise picked up her pen and set it down again. She looked at the wall above the fireplace where a framed document hung, the final court order from June 1882, confirming the Morgan property in her name. She had framed it herself, which Henry had found both practical and sentimental in a way he found entirely characteristic. "Take it," she said. "Are you certain?" "I am always certain when I say something," she said. He looked at her with that expression that had been part of his face for 5 years now, and that still did what it had always done to her internal landscape. "I know," he said. "That is one of the things I love about you." "One of many," she said. "A very long list," he said. She smiled and picked up her pen. "Then accept it," she said. "You have been looking for the right work since you left Dodge City. Here it is." Henry Keller was appointed district judge in January 1888. His reputation for seeing instruments rather than debts, for looking past the power of the party, bringing a case to the specific legal question at its center, made him, within 2 years, one of the most cited judges in the Southern District. He was not popular with the large commercial interests, which he considered a measure of his accuracy. He was not despised by them either, because he was scrupulously fair, and scrupulous fairness was at least predictable. The practice went to Parsons, who ran it well. The Morgan property went on under Louise's management with a hired hand named Torres, a quiet and capable man from New Mexico who had been looking for stable work, and who proved over time to be as knowledgeable about cattle as anyone Louise had ever met. Life arranged itself around these new shapes. Henry was home more days than he was away, and when he was away he wrote actual letters, not quick notes, long letters that Louise read at the kitchen table in the evenings and kept in the same wooden box where she had once kept her father's documents. The letters were full of what he was seeing and thinking, cases that interested him, people he met, observations about the changing landscape of the law as statehood matured into something more established. She wrote back in kind, and these exchanges felt, on both sides, like a continuation of the long conversations that had begun on a Wednesday night in May 1882, when a stranger sat down at her table and started reading. William, at 5, began to show a strong interest in the cattle that his mother considered excellent, and a strong interest in the law documents his father left around the house that his father considered inevitable and somewhat gratifying. Clara, at 2, showed a strong interest primarily in everything that was either too far away to reach or too fragile to touch, which was its own kind of legal challenge. In the summer of 1889, Louise discovered she was expecting for the 3rd time. She told Henry in the kitchen on a Sunday morning with the children in the yard and the window open and the summer air coming through. He set down his coffee and looked at her. "How are you?" he said. "Very well," she said. "You always ask me that first." "I will always ask you that first," he said. "It is the most important question." She crossed the kitchen and sat beside him at the table, and he took her hand and they sat in the morning light with the sound of their children outside, and the coffee going cold between them, and she thought about the night she had stood with a gun over a deed, and a stranger had walked through her door. She thought about all the ways that moment could have gone differently. If the door had not swung open, if Henry Keller had not knocked twice and then tried the handle, if Ned Calloway had sent someone else, or sent no one, or sent someone who looked at the debt instead of the instrument. She thought about the woman she had been that night, alone in the full, practiced, defended sense of the word, carrying something so heavy it had become her posture, her default expression, the shape of how she stood in a room. And she thought about what it had felt like when he said those words, plain as daylight. You have been carrying this alone, not as an accusation, not as a performance of sympathy, as a statement of what he could see, offered to her as a form of acknowledgement, a confirmation that the weight was real, that she had borne it, and that she did not have to bear it that way any longer. She had let him help her carry it. That was what had happened. Not all of it at once. She was not capable of all at once, and she would not want to be, but gradually, in the way that trust is actually built, through small consistencies accumulated over time until they created something load-bearing. And now she sat at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning in the summer of 1889, with the window open and her hand in his, and her children's voices outside, and a third child on the way, and the land outside that had been nearly taken and was absolutely hers, and the man beside her who was absolutely hers and she absolutely his, and the weight she had carried alone for so long distributed, now so naturally between them that she could barely remember the precise shape of what it had felt like. I was thinking, she said. Tell me, he said, about the night you came to the house, the first night. He looked at her. What about it? I was thinking about what you said. That I had been carrying this alone. She paused. No one had ever said that to me before. No one had ever named it. He was quiet for a moment. It seemed important to name it, he said. It was, she said. It was the most important thing anyone has ever said to me, I think. Not because it solved anything, because it meant someone saw it. Henry brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was habitual between them now, so natural it had become its own language. I saw it, he said. I see it. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, another gesture from the private vocabulary they had built together over 7 years, and outside William shouted something and Clara's voice rose in reply, and the morning was full and warm and complete in all its dimensions. Their third child, another son, was born in February 1890. They named him James. He came into the world with such vigorous enthusiasm that Mrs. Gareth, assisting for the third time, declared him the most opinionated newborn she had encountered in 40 years, which was saying something. William, who was 6 and had strong opinions of his own, accepted James with the generosity of an older brother who had done this before. Clara, who was 3 and had no room in her conception of the household for another claim on her parents' attention, took 2 weeks to forgive the universe, and then fell completely in love with her youngest brother, with the intensity of a person choosing something rather than simply accepting it. The Morgan property, the Keller property, though the old name persisted as names for land always do, entered the 1890s in a condition of genuine prosperity. Not extravagant prosperity, not the kind that came from exploiting something or someone, but the solid, earned prosperity that comes from good land managed by people who know it and care for it, combined with, in this case, enough legal intelligence to protect it from those who would take it. Louise turned 38 in the autumn of 1890 and rode the fence line alone in the morning, as she had always done. The property was larger now than it had been when she took it over. She had purchased the adjacent 40 acres when the Peterson brothers consolidated their holdings in 1887, a straightforward transaction that Henry had documented in his own hand for the pleasure of it. The cattle were healthy. The hay was in. The fence was good. She stopped at the high western point where the view opened to the mountains and sat on her horse and looked at the landscape that had been her world for 38 years and thought about all the things it contained. Her father's struggle and failure and partial redemption. Her mother's early death. Her own years of solitary management, the specific terror of 11 months believing she would lose it, and the morning everything changed. And she thought about what had grown from that morning, what had been planted in the space that terror had cleared, not just the marriage, not just the children, though those were the great gifts. Something older and more essential, the ability to be known by someone, the ability to carry something together, the ability to stand in a room with another person and not need the wall to be as high as it had been. She had built herself in silence, and she was proud of what she had built. She would not undo any of it. But a self-built in silence has a quality that a self-built in company does not. It is strong in the vertical axis and sometimes fragile in the horizontal, capable of bearing great individual weight and uncertain what to do with the weight offered freely by another. Henry Keller had taught her the horizontal axis, not by demanding it, not even by asking for it, simply by being present and attentive and honest, and by saying one true thing on one night in a house where the door had swung open on its own. She turned her horse toward home. The morning air was cold, and the mountains were blue, and the cattle were in the far pasture, and the smoke from the chimney was rising in a thin line that meant Henry was up and making coffee, which he always did on the morning she rode. She rode home at a canter across her own land, the land that was wholly hers and that she had never had to carry alone again. And she thought about what she would say to him when she came through the door, and he looked up from the coffee and gave her the full weight of his attention, which was the greeting she had come home to for 8 years now, and which never felt ordinary. She thought she would probably just sit down at the table and take the coffee he poured, and they would talk in the comfortable way of people who have run out of anything to hide from each other, and the children would come downstairs and the day would begin, and somewhere in the middle of it all, she would look at him across some ordinary moment and feel the specific rightness of having let someone all the way in. Not because she needed him to survive. She had already proven she could survive alone. Because a life fully shared was a different and larger thing than a life alone, and she was large enough to hold it. Henry Keller was at the kitchen table with a law document and 2 cups of coffee when she came through the door. He looked up immediately. He always looked up immediately. "Good ride," he said. "Excellent," she said, pulling off her coat. "Clara has decided to rename one of the calves," he said. "She is calling it Silas, which I find notable." Louise stopped in the act of hanging her coat. Then she laughed her genuine laugh, the one that lived in her whole chest, the one that had become one of the best sounds in Henry Keller's world. "She does not even know what that name means," she said. "No," Henry said, with a restrained, warm smile that meant he was deeply amused. "She just thought it sounded right for a calf that keeps escaping." Louise sat down and took the coffee, and it was perfect, because he had been making her coffee for 8 years and knew exactly how she wanted it, and she wrapped both hands around the cup in the cold morning and looked at him across the table. "I was thinking about you," she said, "out there, the first night. The first night I walked through the wrong door. The night you walked through the right door," she said, "and told me the truth." He looked at her with his full, unhurried attention. "And what were you thinking?" "That it was the best thing that happened to this property," she said. "And the best thing that happened to me." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was warm from the cup. And outside in the yard, William was explaining something to Clara at considerable volume, and James was making the specific noise that meant he was awake and had requirements, and the morning was beginning its full and complicated life. And Henry Keller looked at Louise Morgan Keller across the kitchen table and saw her entirely, the strong vertical axis and the hard one horizontal one. The woman who had held a gun over a deed, and the woman who had said, "Ask me and stay." The woman who had been carrying it alone, and the woman who had finally, thoroughly, permanently let him help her carry it. "That is the best thing I have heard today," he said. "It is early yet," she said. "True," he agreed. "But I have considerable confidence in the rest of the day." She smiled. He smiled. The fire was warm and the coffee was good, and the land outside was fully, legally, permanently theirs. And the life they had built from one swinging door and one honest sentence was everything that either of them had needed and neither of them had known how to ask for, until the asking became the only natural thing left to do.